Morning YouTube, Warbles on a lot here, ready for Outsiders on the 11th of October. First Moondog should be a separate broadcast afterwards.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy and you're not.
He is, we aren't. This morning's Outsiders are Sophie Black, she's a journalist and editor. Trish Jar, she's from the Centre for Independent Studies, and Sabine Wolf, she's a writer and commentator. Hello. No, they've even got microphones. Try it again, come on. Come on, let's just go from the top.
Hello.
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 Oh,
Yes,
wow. Splendid. And that's sadly all we have time for this morning. It was a big thing for the Liberal Party yesterday. We had the New South Wales Liberal Party conference, which was conspicuous for the presence of a certain chap in the middle there, wearing an open-necked shirt, looking a little bit, I don't know, tense. It was Tony Abbott, having a good time. The conference was full of praise for Tony Abbott, as was Malcolm Turnbull, who spoke. There was a little bit of unease in the room as well.
We're not run by factions. We're not run by, well, you may dispute that, but to tell you from experience, we are not run by factions.
Oh, Sophie Blake, I feel sorry for the man.
So awkward. But look, it's only fair. He's had a very easy run.
Yeah.
He needed a bit of character building, I don't know, sniping from the backbenches or...
We're better, Tricia, than the New South Wales convocation of the Liberal Party, but perhaps not his traditional allies at the moment.
Yes, well, New South Wales has always had a reputation for being a bit like that. But honestly, I don't know that this is necessarily an example of Malcolm Turnbull being caught out. I think it was, there's a certain kind of brand of humour. I mean, his political history suggests that he knows better than anyone the role of the quote unquote factions in the Liberal Party. And I think that this is a way of, a bit of a joke without, I guess, necessarily trying to come across making a ham-fisted joke.
Should he be sailing, do you think, this have been that close to the wind, if this is just Malcolm joshing about?
If it was a joke, it was an incredibly poorly judged one, because when I first listened to it, I thought, when I first heard that it had happened, I thought, oh, well, it could be one of those things where the New South Wales Liberal Party kind of has a bit of a laugh at itself.
Yeah.
And then I actually listened to the audio, and that's not what's happening. There's a lot of bitterness still in that room.
Angry laughs.
It was angry laughter, very angry laughter.
As only Liberals can do.
As only Liberals can do. And I mean, it's a silly thing to get up and say in front of the New South Wales Liberal division. They are possibly the most highly factionalised division there is out there. Yes. I once heard someone say actually that they make Minchin and Pine, two other great factional drivers, look like gentlemen. So.
What is it, Trish, with the Liberal Party and factions? This is a state of constant denial that there's any sort of organised difference of opinion within the broad church of Australian liberalism. It's probably not true.
Yes, well, I think that whole Howard thing with the broad church was definitely part of it. And I also think that there's this, they look at the Labor Party, and the Labor Party has this, I guess, caucus. They have caucuses along factional lines, and then they kind of say, oh, well, the Liberal Party doesn't have those, therefore we don't have factions. But I mean, everyone knows. I mean, you hang out with friends who are in the Liberal Party, and then there's this like kind of, it's like a rite of passage almost. You have a joke where you go, there are no factions in the Liberal Party, and everyone kind of taps their nose, and it's a funny thing. Everyone knows that it's. I don't know why they're in denial about it. I think that it would be it would reduce their argument against the Labor Party. But
there they are, Sophie, falling between the Catholics and the Libertarians. But this focus on what Malcolm Turnbull says, I think, is sort of interesting, and the way he says things. And this has sort of been the story of the week has been parsing the Prime Minister, how the stuff that he comes up with is different, and we feel different about ourselves as a result. So
that's still the sort of ongoing thread amongst all the political commentary. We're still getting mileage out of Tony Abbott and what Tony Abbott might have said about something and how Malcolm Turnbull has said it differently.
with
And that's
how
all
many
he needs to
flags
do
it's
at this
chose.
point. Yeah, that's really all he needs to do at this point.
Well, and to be fair, I think it's probably true, isn't it, Sabine? It's all he has done to this point.
That's true. But, I think it's kind of good that we do actually have a Prime Minister who can speak in whole sentences now and whose answer is not always stop the boats, we stop the boats. So, I mean, I'm
much
still...
as we commended his discipline.
Yes. I just would have liked a little bit of a link between what the question was and the stop the boats answer occasionally, maybe. But so, I mean, I think it's quite good still that Turnbull, and he does have a tendency towards waffliness, but I think it's quite good that he is actually a significant point of difference, and I think that's what we still need at this point.
That thing, Tricia, the sort of the... it's sort of taken the politics out of politics weirdly, don't you think? I mean, listening to one man who made his politics so self-evident and another man who conceals his politics behind a well-cut jacket and a few more words. You think, Tricia, that sort of sums it up?
Oh, well, I think one of the things that kind of struck me in terms of, I guess, comparing Turnbull and Abbott and how they would have said something was the whole conversation that we had about, I guess, radicalisation after the Parramatta shooting. And one of the things that Turnbull said that I think got a lot of people slightly confused was how he said that it's not compulsory to live in Australia. And then you have a kind of an army of kind of conservative commentators saying, well, how is that any different to love it or leave it t-shirts? And it's like, well, no, it's actually quite different. And it would be different if Tony Abbott said something like that, because there's a context to both of them where I think you kind of have this idea that you can expect, I suppose, good faith from them. So I think
interesting choice of words as we consider the political moment.
Yeah.
Let's have a listen to Malcolm Turnbull on that incident that 10 days ago, the very sad death in Parramatta, and the PM responded in a interesting and different way.
It is not compulsory to live in Australia. If you find Australian values, unpalatable, then there's a big wide world out there, and people have got freedom of movement.
He backed off a bit first, didn't he, Sabine, and then came back with that sort of slightly harder line later in the week.
Yeah, look, I kind of enjoyed this turning it around and saying, actually, well, you know what Australian values are about multiculturalism, and Australian values are about valuing diversity. So he really turned it around and turned it back on the conservative commentators who have been behind a lot of this this push towards both going at him and also having a go at people who are a little bit different within society. So I actually quite liked it. I thought it was a good point of difference for him again.
But it's still the conservative commentators, Sophie, are sort of pushing, need to go harder, need to go harder. This is an endless battle that we need to fight. And I'm not sure that he isn't fighting it, actually. And
no, because I think he still very plainly said, if you don't like it here, leave, in so many words. But I think this is a very stark example of when words matter. I think of anything that Turnbull has, any issue that Turnbull has had to deal with thus far, the way he communicates on this issue is so important. And we can already see re-engagement from various leaders within the Muslim community because they have been energised by Turnbull's approach.
And Turnbull pushing for that specifically. I mean, saying with my bed, let's come together and talk as a response. That's
it's the kind of national healing that we all really need at the moment, right? It's about reaching out. It's a move away from that very divisionary, exclusive politics that I think Tony Abbott practiced. And I mean, I feel hopeful.
And yet, the outsiders here on Sunday Extra, Sophie Black, Trish Jarr and Sabine Wolfe, and yet Trish, there's still deliberate politics on both sides. I mean, Tony Abbott, when he talked about death cult, there was a very conscious piece of political positioning, and I suspect Turnbull is doing likewise. It's just such a 180-degree switch.
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily a full 180. I think there's definitely maybe 90 degrees, but
give me
I think
96. Come on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's obviously a definite difference. I don't know if it's political posturing so much as I think these are things that Turnbull genuinely believes. Otherwise, he wouldn't be saying them. And I think he's had this ability so far to bring a kind of a Turnbull spin to all of these issues that his naysayers are all about, you can't possibly believe that, both on the left and the right for that matter. And I think that I guess it's political for the purposes of communication, in the sense that this is how you communicate a political message, a message about the government's position on an issue to everyone. But it's also, I think, something that he really believes, and I think that means that for the same reason, in the same way that Sabine is, I'm quite hopeful.
I think it also goes to the efficacy of Abbott's approach thus far in terms
absolutely.
of combating the radicalisation of youth. And I think the comments from Senator Concetta Fierravanti-Wells this week,
Yeah, that's
over
interesting.
the last week, have been fascinating, because she has been charged with consulting with various members of the Muslim community over the last few months. And her rhetoric has changed markedly. And she has turned around to say that, you know, this isn't, we need to re-engage with these youths, and this is, and not treat it first and foremost as a national security issue.
A clear sense from her that she's had a hand tied behind her back in that conversation.
That is
to
a
this
massive,
point.
massive shift to what we've heard in the past. And I think that's really, really positive, and that is how we should be talking about the issue of radicalisation.
And yet elsewhere, it remains heated. We've had protests in Bendigo in the last day over a mooted mosque, and we had earlier in the week, we had the left's answer to Tony Abbott, Mark Latham, talking on the issue of radicalisation.
It's a problem that's been a long time coming. It started in the 1980s with family reunion or unskilled Muslim migration to Western Sydney. Whole or large parts of suburbs have got welfare dependency problems. And it pains me to say, in Western Sydney, there is a Muslim problem. After Man Monis, who came from Western Sydney after the shooting last week, we have to recognise this is not just radical Islamic ideology. It's also people with too much time on their hands, too many opportunities to sit around in groups bitching about Western culture, bitching about the American president, bitching about the Australian Prime Minister, and getting up to no good. So the best thing the federal government can do is get these people out to work, break down the welfare dependency in Western Sydney.
There's the context, isn't it, Sophie, into which Malcolm Turnbull steps with that sort of anger, with that sort of very narrow cast of the issue. You have a Prime Minister suddenly on top of that who's taking a far broader view and a more inclusive view.
Which is a very welcome one and a very necessary one, if given, you know, issues like the Bendigo Mosque and the way that has effectively taken a whole community by hostage. But, you know, and Latham's comments to characterise it as a Muslim problem, I think that's one of the first problems around discussions of this nature, is to lump this somehow homogenous group of people as the Muslim community.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a ridiculous proposition.
But I find it so interesting how he almost gets there, right? He talks about problems of employment. He talks about problems of welfare. He's starting to talk about social issues, and then he kind of pulls himself back and says, "Oh, it's a Muslim problem." And it's like, "Oh, Mark, you're so close."
He had a
Latham
point in there somewhere.
But
Classic Mark
it's the
Latham.
thing, though, isn't it, Trish, that suddenly, I mean, it's a final point, that there's still politics here, but we get a sense that politics is now trying to fix this rather than milk it.
Yes, I think that's definitely true. I mean, what Sabine said about Mark Latham is absolutely correct. I mean, at the end of the day, you've kind of got this issue of, I guess, we from the de-radicalisation perspective, the kind of the friendly, the fluffy version, we talk about alienation, and then Mark Latham talks about it in a different sense. He highlights the example of work, and he highlights the example of welfare dependence. In any other context, we would be able to quite easily draw the link between social alienation, isolation, and welfare dependence not being in work. And we do that regularly in all sorts of other conversations. But I think actually kind of drawing a link between the two and saying, well, let's look at our policies.
Yeah.
Let's actually look at how we can, I guess, heal this and like stitch it together again.
And in fact, Ahmed Fahour of Australia Post said exactly
Same
that,
thing,
but in a
more
very
measured
different way.
Look, thanks to all. It's a complicated conversation. To get a sense that we're sort of stepping on an interesting path.
Okay, we'll cut this movie here and recommence with First Dog on the Moon.